Okay, so welcome. My name is Wolf Gruner. I'm the director of the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and I have the distinct pleasure to introduce Alina Bothe, who is. Did you finish your PhD? So she is a recent PhD, very recent. Congratulations! Yeah. So but she is a very accomplished one. She published already, co-edited 2 books, one on gender in history and one on gender and memory in the digital age. And her kind of core expertise is on memory, digital memory, and the dissertation, and she will talk about this more, is about studying actually the Visual History Archive as one part of her dissertation. She studied history, politics, and Eastern European history at the Free University in Berlin, and was then following as a PhD candidate, a fellow at the Center for Jewish Studies in Berlin. That's actually where I was a fellow this summer, and they were hosting me very nicely, and that's where we actually met. And I found her work so interesting that I decided to bring her here. But this is not the only reason. She also won the International Teaching Fellowship we actually give out once a year for a class she is co-teaching at the Free University on one specific event in German Jewish history during the Holocaust, the deportation of Jews originally from Poland, from Berlin. And she did a class where the students conducted original research with testimonies, but not exclusively with testimonies. And they this class won the teaching fellowship for this year. Besides that, she also published articles, so she's really a very accomplished recent PhD, I have to say. So give her a hand, and
Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction. And before I start with my lecture, I would like to take the time and the chance to thank Professor Wolf Gruner for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to be here. I see so many topics I would like to expand my research into, and this last not even 24 hours here have been very inspiring for me. And I also would like to thank Sheffield for organizing my trip, for taking care of all those small details that make it a really pleasurable and memorable experience for me. So thank you very much. I have one small remark before I start with my lecture. I would like to apologize for having a written script for today's lecture, but as you can hear, English is not my first language, and I tend to stick better to the time frame when having a written script. The topic that I will talk about now stems from my PhD thesis and is about the connection or bonding that users feel when watching testimonies from the Visual History Archive. It has often been argued that this can be explained by the content of the testimony and the intimate narration the survivors share with those who listen. And meanwhile, I will not contest this argument. I can't explain the impact of testimonies on users alone. Therefore, I will argue for taking the media of the testimonies into account as well, as Alan Rosen so profoundly has shown for the David Bode collection. The voices and direct transmission of voices are relevant. My PhD thesis discusses, as Wolf Gruner just mentioned, the digital turn in Shoah history, and therefore the Visual History Archive as a digital archive is the paradigmatic archive for looking into the digital turn of Shoah studies. I developed an epistemological approach, the virtual in-between of memory, which I will explain to you now. The VHA testimonies have been originally videographed, which means that the material basis of the testimonies was changed when they arrived here in Los Angeles. They were transformed into digital sources. Their physical form was no longer a videotape, but dissolved itself into binary code. James Young noted the influence of media on the testimonies as early as 1988 in his seminal Writing and Rewriting the Holocaust, Narrative and the Consequences of Interpretation. And I quote, For every medium brings its own generic properties to bear on the material it transmits. Each shapes as well as reflects particular events, quote end. Further on, he argues that the videotape is documenting the act of narrating testimony, how, I quote, experiences enter speech, that point at which memory is transformed into language, quote end. Following Young, I would like to state that the testimony is the moment of transfer or translation of experiences that became memories into language and narration. First are the experiences of the survivors during the Shoah, which turned into memory in the decades past liberation and needed to be translated into language and narration to be passed on. The narration itself is meanwhile structured by the medium. The Visual History Archive was already from the beginning planned as a digital archive, before the idea of the digital archive was en vogue. This quote from Steven Spielberg in USA Today from 1995 shows how the archive was sought to be digital from the very beginning. And I quote, "The testimonies will be presented in any order you want to access them. For instance, in order as to the first pogrom, the first action, roundup, the first ghettos, the first Jews to be enslaved in camps, then systematically murdered. All that will be presented in chronology, and every testimony will be like a mini-documentary. And we are putting out CD-ROMs with testimonies and archival information. These will be available in software venues, and all proceeds will go back into the survivors of the Shoah Fund." Quote end. This is a description of a digital archive to come for an audience that was just beginning to recognize the impact and possibilities of the new medium, 1995. It shows that there were nearly no visualizations to explain this visionary technical approach for a broader audience. In the first German newspaper articles about the VHA, you can read how the journalists struggled with language to give a picture of this new kind of archive. Being sought as a digital archive from the very beginning, even while the original testimonies were taped on Betacam standard, the Visual History Archive is the paradigmatic archive to reflect upon the digital turn of Shoah history. Digitization has changed Shoah history and historiography on three levels, as I argue. Research, representation, understood here as all kinds of historical narration, and perception. I think this is very obvious when you look at the VHA. Only because of the digitization it was possible to segment the interviews and index them in a very searchable way. No other archive of Shoah survivors' testimonies has made this effort before, so the archival indexing of the testimonies is innovative. Therefore, in the VHA, it is possible to search for topics unsearchable in other archives. Digitization is the key here to research. Concerning the level of representation, you can see very different modes of digital narrations. Online exhibitions, apps, the clips made by students in Eyewitness, or the non-linear scholarly attempt Jeffrey Chandler has recently undertaken on the USC publishing platform Scala, using clips from the VHA testimonies. The third level is perception, the way users experience the testimonies. In my talk today, I will focus on this third level. After these opening observations, I will now go into detail about what I understand to be the digital turn and the specifics of the virtual sphere. After this, I will explain my epistemological approach, the virtual in-between of memory, which stems from a close reading of the philosophical and theoretical works about the in-between or third space by Homi Bhabha, Hannah Arendt, and Reinhard Koselleck. Don't be afraid. I won't just offer you theory today, but I will discuss my close analysis of users' comments beneath VHA testimonies on YouTube in the end. I would like to start my theoretical discussion with a few quotations and observations. Quite frankly, there were several occasions in which I wanted to reach through the screen and strangle an interviewer who had just shut down a survivor's seeming digression into a topic of vital interest to me. This is a statement by the eminent Holocaust historian Christopher Browning. At first glance, Browning's statement is a bit confusing as he makes it in the middle of his introduction to his 2010 book Remembering Survival Inside a Nazi Slave Labor Camp, right where he is explaining his methods, his sources, the theoretical backbone to the story he researched and is going to tell in his book, and might even be a bit funny, and is indeed mirroring feelings I guess most researchers in the archive have experienced, but usually do not talk about so bluntly, let it publish. So Browning's statement tells us about his perception of the interviewees, the interviewers, and the researcher's wish to immerse or even intervene into that situation of recording or giving testimony. The moment of perception has different layers of time, space, and subjects in it. I'll come back to this when I discuss the YouTube comments more closely. The constellation of agents is a shifting triangle. The witness is speaking to the interviewer as well as to the future listener. The interviewer is following a protocol, maybe pursuing own interests, and acts as a stand-in for the future listener. Meanwhile, the listener wants to overcome the chronospatial obstacle or better barriers between him or herself and the interviewing situation and to replace the interviewer. What Browning commented on here in a slightly sarcastical way is the wish or longing to immerse into the scene of testimony. From an academic standpoint, being able to ask the questions he wanted to know the answers for, but also with sympathy towards the survivors struggling to tell their story, while the interviewers applied a certain pressure to keep the narration focused. Reading Browning's statement unveils his wish to intervene, which seems, as I will argue, possible only because of the mediatic setting. The second quotes are coming from two Berlin school students at high school level. From a project class that my colleague Christina Brüning has taught. After class, the students filled in a questionnaire about this learning experience. And I quote, "It was much more personal than reading a text about this time, and even though one could not ask questions, one had the feeling that the survivors would speak directly to you," quote end. And from the second student, "Yes, it is something different. On one's own, one isn't distracted and has more like the feeling one would be talking with this person." The results from Christina's research can be found in other projects as well. When I teach with the VHA at university, I always ask my students to hand in a questionnaire about their experiences, and it's often, of course, more reflected than the school students' answers, but it points into the same direction. And please note here the difficulty of students to grapple the strange feeling of connection or bonding they have, and which they describe within the knowledge that a real or physical meeting or dialogue has not taken place, but something alike. The same kind of comments can be found on YouTube, as I will show you later. Those quotations and observations suggest a kind of encounter or meeting. Alida Assmann and Juliane Brauer called this a virtuelle Begegnung, a virtual encounter. Meanwhile, they are not considering the medium of the encounter. They argue for the deep emotional reaction towards the testimonies that many experience when being face to face with the survivors. They only recognize the audiovisual dimension of the testimonies. For them, I quote in translation, "The virtual encounter enables the observer with more imaginary clearances for their own involvement and interpretation," quote end. I've called this already an as-if dialogue to make obvious that this is not a classical dialogue between two persons, but the intention, wish, or assumption of a dialogue by the archive users. I follow the lead Assmann and Brauer have given in calling it a virtual encounter, aiming for the medium that enables the as-if dialogue or virtual encounter that are prominent in the observations I just gave you. These observations and examples should give you some impressions of users' reactions or perceptions of testimonies. And while readers occasionally contact an author after reading a book, there seems to be a special quality to the mediatized perception that can be only explained by the medium the testimonies are shared and distributed in. Digitization changes the way we understand history. It changes the way we research and write history. So, digitization, and with it the digital turn, brings us to a fundamental crossroad of history. We need to think of the challenges ahead and try to better understand them. I would now like to turn my attention towards the digital turn, and the virtual sphere. Theoretically, the topic has been touched, but it needs further analysis. Todd Presner has researched the aspects of an algorithm concerning the VHA, and I would also like to mention Rachel Baum's research on the digital and Shoah memory, which includes the VHA. The digital turn, different to other paradigmatic bends in the road like the linguistic turn, does not only describe a new direction of research, but also the ongoing digitization of the world around us. The virtual sphere is different to the former analog sphere in regards to the following aspects. The most important changes in the digital turn are on 3 levels. First, the chronospatial framework. Second, new knowledge organization, as well as third, the economy. Concerning the chronospatial framework, we have to consider the reduction of distances, like one can show with Skype. The video phone call brings a new layer of connection due to the audiovisual instant connection, as a regular phone call does. In academia, the new, and new as in the last 2 decades, aspects of knowledge organization are, for example, online library catalogs, databases, and large-scale digitization. But not only the dissemination and distribution of knowledge changes, also the accumulation, as one can see with the often quoted example of the Wikipedia. A third and important aspect of the new aspects of knowledge organization are algorithms and search engines, structuring our research and access to the world. Further on, we need to discuss big data. In regard to economy, I would like to point to web economy itself, companies that are shaping the digital like Google, Facebook, Twitter, Yahoo, or Instagram, as well as companies like Apple or Microsoft. They became dominant players in the global economy in the last 2 decades, and we need to take the web-related economy into account as well. The digital media opens a new space of possibilities, which is still to be mapped. To me, the digital, which is not a very specific term, has 3 interdependent levels. First, the binary code is the central transformation of every information. Second, the web, which produces the virtual sphere as a space of cultural newness. And third, those digital devices which became part of our everyday life. To describe the characteristics of the virtual sphere, I rely upon what I call the 3 I's: immersion, interactivity, and instancy. Immersion describes how one is drawn into a medium or a work of art. Nicholas Carr puts it like this, and I quote, "When we are online, we are often oblivious to everything else going on around us. The real world recedes as we process the floods of symbols and stimuli coming through our devices," quote end. Interaction reminds us that, different to other media, the virtual sphere is not a classical one-way medium like the book, but allows for users to actively engage and shape the medium themselves. Users are not only consumers, but can be, they do not need to, can be producers. Instantly depicts the acceleration and compression of time and space. Something happens immediately. In recent media studies, the media itself is often described as an in-between, something that connects but also leaves a trace of its own on the content that is communicated. Following the suggestions in media studies on the in-between, I went to postmodern theory to have a firm theoretical grounding for the changes we can observe due to the digital turn. To understand these changes, we need an epistemological approach towards the digital or better virtual sphere. For the virtual in-between of memory, I suggest drawing from different writings about the in-between, or third space. For today's lecture, I will only discuss Homi Bhabha's and Hannah Arendt's approaches to the in-between very briefly. With this approach, I try to react to the haptic intangibility of the digital media that are only accessible through their hardware and whose essentiality is taking place in a physically intangible space. Also, the virtual needs a material base. The sphere it creates is not walkable, not even with data suits or glasses. It's a sphere that is entirely composed of data and calculations. But inside this sphere, communication, knowledge transfer, and economic exchange is taking place. To keep it short and simple, we could say we can't walk into the digital, but we can act within. So it's a paradoxical space, accessible and inaccessible, touchable and intangible at the same moment. This is not an imagined but a real space that is challenging our understanding of space as such. Humans need space to interact with each other, and they construct these physical spaces as well as cultural, literal, and mental spaces while they act within them. To describe this paradoxical, indefined situation, the in-between seems to be a convincing approach. It is understood here as a matrix along the axis of space, time, and agents, and is often discussed as space in between interstitials or third space. Homi Bhabha introduces the in-between as such, and I quote, "These in-between spaces provide the terrain for elaborating strategies of selfhood, singular or communal, that initiate new signs of identity and innovative sites of collaboration and contestation in the act of defining the idea of society itself." Quote end. The virtual sphere can be understood as an intervening and initiating space which is permanently changing. The main act or the main action in the in-between is the speech act, the statement or utterance. The act of enunciation, which represents the process and performance of the speaking subject, is the imminent future domain of the discourse. Enunciation is the ongoing articulation of languages, ideas, thoughts, which always try to capture the present as it is passing into the future. This is Homi Bhabha's description of the act of enunciation. Every testimony is an act of enunciation, a speech act in which experiences are communicated as memory. Bhabha's discussion of the in-between is linked to post-colonial studies, and his stance here is that migrants are those who are acting in the in-between. Hannah Arendt, in addition, has given us a broader understanding of the subjects in the in-between, to which I rely and which I will explain in a minute. And Bhabha himself opened up the realm of agents when in his reading of Emmanuel Levinas he proclaimed, I quote, "The third space as an interstitial moment in between must now be understood as the side of the witness," and therefore connects this theoretical approach to Shoah history. The in-between with Bhabha is a space of translation and hybridity, or as he writes himself, it is neither the one nor the other, but something else besides. Inside this space, meaning and knowledge are negotiated. For Bhabha, it is, quote, "the inter that carries the burden of meaning of culture," quote end. Hannah Arendt wrote about the in-between in The Human Condition, first published in 1958, where she called it the web of relationships, in German das Bezugsgewebe menschlicher Angelegenheiten. For her, the speech act and the interactions of humans as well as their relations are of defining quality. Bhabha adds to this the space of enunciation where the production of meaning takes place. History and memory are part of this meaning. Speech acts and actions open for Arendt a web of relations to which everyone is interwoven and weaves himself or herself into. These interests, so she writes, constitute in the word's most literal significance something which inter-est, which lies between people and therefore can relate and bind them together, quote end. So each contact between subjects is in between, but Arendt specifies this sort. I quote, no, I don't quote here, I'll leave this aside. The first in between is constructing a second that is hugely different. It is more than a discourse or archive in Foucault's terminology, but also a very visual description towards human relations, a web with strings and knots, woven by generations, safe and destroyable at the same moment. Arendt explained the second in-between as follows, and I quote, "The second subjective in-between is not tangible, since there are no tangible objects into which it could solidify. The process of acting and speaking can leave behind no such results and end products," quote end. Her term of the in-between is symbolic or metaphorical. But although the in-between is intangible and seems to be metaphorical, she states, quote, "But for all its intangibility, this in-between is no less real than the world of things we visibly have in common," quote end. Between the virtual and the analog sphere are borders which can't be overcome categorically, but which are dissolving more and more every day. Digital media is leaving the relatively fixed and stable form of the internet or the digital archive and finds its way into everyday life. Keywords here are, for example, smart homes or virtual realities. It is necessary to think the present from the digital, which is a new and permanently shifting border. Barber's neither the one nor the other, as well as Arendt's no less real, are both congruent to the digital media's quality to be neither real nor unreal. One cannot walk into the digital archive but to use it as a bodily experience on many levels. The idea of the something else besides allows to handle shifts and to see how a new space with new rules has come into existence. The virtual in-between, in the virtual in-between, the speech act follows the conditions of the digital, happens within a different logic of time and space. It's a virtual space of experience where the testimonies of survivors are perceived with high intensity, as I will show you. Concerning the future of the virtual in-between of memory, we can observe a compression or concentration of agents. More and more people are weaving themselves into the web of relations. And if you see Sony Ericsson's future report for 2020, it states that about 5 billion billion smartphones will be available and people will be logged in. The virtual sphere is still growing and not a permanent fixture. It is used more intensely now, which leads to further concentration. And meanwhile, users are used to new forms of speech acts and have learned a new understanding of the chronospatial framework about communication over time and space. The medium itself triggers them to immerse and to interact, both explaining the wish of users to interview in testimonies and to ask their own questions. This is part of the explanation on why users often have the impression of a real meeting with the survivors. The virtual sphere is a new space with new negotiations and speech acts emerging. It allows for interacting without the limits of the chronospatial. Within the virtual sphere, new patterns of communication evolve. Let me just mention Joseph Weizenbaum's ELISA, the psychoanalytical dialogue program from the 1960s, and new conceptions of agency that we can see with Siri or other speech recognition software. Users can overcome the physical limitations and interact and immerse deeply with the testimonies, but there's still a layer of unapproachability upon these interactions. Therefore, it is important to mark the differences of the virtual in-between of memory to the analog sphere. And I thank you now for bearing with me through all this theoretical discussion, and I will leave the theoretical burdened field here and turn to my very practical approach in my case study on the comments beneath the testimonies on YouTube. A few notes on YouTube, even though all of you will be aware of it. YouTube is the biggest, most important and most successful video clip sharing website. It was founded in 2005 and bought by Google in 2006. YouTube can be conceptualized as an archive, a huge TV program, or a database. I would be much too simple, as Andrew Keane did, just to see it as a space of banality and amateurs. YouTube is very much a place of everyday knowledge transfer, circulation, of entertainment and learning, meanwhile following the logics of capitalist distribution. Many institutions in the field of Shoah memory and education, like Yad Vashem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, or the USC Shoah Foundation, use YouTube as a commemorative distribution channel. Users decide on how much they participate on YouTube. If they upload videos and have their own channels, being active, being semi-active when watching and commenting clips, or just passively consume them. Commenting on YouTube, like on every other social media like Facebook, has been discussed in Germany with quite some intensity due to the imminent refugee crisis. It is also a topic of fierce discussion among the YouTube community and other communities of social media. It focuses on whether to allow or disable comments on certain clips. Many users advocate the freedom of speech, while others, especially those who post clips on YouTube, take a different stand on this. This is the message of user Rachel Alex on Fire on why she disabled comments to her very often watched slideshow, Children of the Holocaust on YouTube, and I quote, "Thank you for watching and rating. Sorry to all that would have left messages of support or sympathy, but I've had to disable comments due to an overwhelming number of racist, hateful posts. It's an unfortunate reality that there are people who wish to deny that the Holocaust has ever happened, and I will not have that hateful untruth attached to my video." Quote end. This debate will be mirrored in some of the posts that I will show you now. But first I would like to explain my research design. For 2 years, between March 2013 and March 2015, I have on a regular basis looked through a wide sample of testimonies and comments on YouTube. From this base of research, I've decided for a close analysis of the comments of the 10 most watched testimonies in March 2015, and you can see them here on the slide with the names of the survivors, the views in 2013, the views in 2015 and 16. I've just done a new data point in preparation for this lecture, and you can also see the number of comments that each testimony gained during this time. Different to the time span 2013 to 2015, the most watched testimonies and their ranking have not changed. Meanwhile, the increase of views and comments has been very different. For Alan Brunt's testimony, for example, this is here, there are nearly 200 new comments, most of them caused by 2 heated discussions that were initiated by the same user and are still going on. So it could be 250 by today. It's 10 days that I had the last look on this. There was no sample methodology here at hand for me doing this research, so I followed the standards of historical discourse analysis as well as grounded theory. I could not overcome the aporia of following the YouTube inherent logic of a ranking. The USC Shoah Foundation has been present on YouTube for about 9 years, and while in the first years the numbers of views were quite low, it's grown since, as the table shows. Memorial institutions like the Shoah Foundation or Yad Vashem have their own style of using YouTube, which is quite atypical for using the video sharing platform at all. First of all, unedited historical sources are distributed. Different to the last 1 or 2 years, the first clips of the USC Shoah Foundation have not been made specifically for YouTube. Secondly, the clips are really long in comparison to the standard YouTube clip, when you see that the testimonies runs for 2, 3, 4 hours, and normally it's about 15 seconds, the attention span on YouTube. Thirdly, users spend a very long period of time with one clip, and they tend to return to watch further testimonies, at least among those who comment on the testimonies. By using the comments from YouTube from my analysis, I could, of course, only analyze those who decided to comment, but different to other studies who raise their data with questionnaires or discussions, I used comments that were not made in the context of a study, but were a desire for the users to do. I structured the analysis of a few hundred comments beneath each testimony along 5 categories: anti-Semitic statements, critique about the interview, self-revelation about the users, and discussions of the testimony's content and broader historical context, which I will leave aside here, and fifth, the perception of the interviewee. This allowed me to handle the amount of comments pragmatically, but also shows the most often used categories. So now I want to show you some very telling examples. I'm not going to read all the statements you can find on the slides, but to always pick up 1 or 2, and you'll have the other ones on the slide. And I think they should be clearly readable. Communication online can be an What's this? I mean, it's blank, but
Let me take a look. Sorry.
There it is.
there it is. Thank you. Communication online can be anonymous. To add weight to their arguments, users need to reveal part of their identities or of their personal feelings. With some statements, you can realize the need and the urge to communicate their impressions or their family attachment to this history. As you can see in this quote, thankfully, my grandmother did what little she could to hide a Jewish family in the cellar of her home in Serbia. Quote end. A very difficult topic are the anti-Semitic messages, many of them beneath the testimony of Abraham Bomber, who is one of the very few survivors of Treblinka II and a survivor who featured prominently in Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. Both examples that I show you now are taken from comments beneath his testimony, and actually one can say that they are still not as bad as some others that I unfortunately had to read. This is hate speech of quite some intensity that you have to encounter here. And I will read the first example. After the haircuts, they went into the delousing chamber, were sprayed with an insecticide and walked out under their own power. Bomber incorrectly believes they were gassed to death in the delousing chambers, and their corpses were removed from the room in 1 to 2 minutes. Then enters a new batch. He actually is mostly telling the truth, but falsely assumes what happened after the haircuts. If they were to be gassed, they wouldn't even need to cut hair, but if they did, they'd use clippers and not real barbers. So what you can see from this, beside its Shoah denial, is that the person who decided to comment this was quite aware of Bomber's testimony and was taken his testimony as the reason to comment. Most of the anti-Semitic statements are commented on by other users. Some of the reactions include a lot of verbal force. So we see that there are indeed users who feel obliged not to leave the space to the group they define as haters and trolls in the net jargon. I quote 2 examples here. Quote, "It's obvious haters have parked on this page and they bear the same guilt as those who participated in this genocide. Shame on you all for daring to state this madness never occurred. You will receive your just recompense for disputing the truth." Quote end. And the users asked to disable comments, as I've already mentioned. I'd rather you allow ratings and disable comments. Ratings is another kind of the logics of the YouTube structure. A really important criterion is how users respond to the style of the interviewer and the person of the interviewer. A typical example is this comment directed towards the interviewer of survivor Renee Firestone. Quote, "This man needs to let her tell her story and wait until she gets to his answers." Interviewers are often accused of interrogating the survivors, so these comments are from Olga Lengyel's testimony. I quote, "Was this an interrogation or an interview? Stopped watching 2 minutes in." Quote, and again, "The interviewer lady sounds too rude. I'm Olga Lengyel fan because of her whole story and the book, and she patiently here, and this woman sounds like she's going to hit her or something. I hate this woman accent," in brackets, interviewer. Please do remember here my opening example from Christopher Browning's Survival about his wish to reach through the screen and to strangle the interviewers. I'll come back to this in a minute. The perception of the interviewer is especially interesting when it's leaving the usual path and is offering new insights. Normally, it's not possible to communicate non-sympathy of a survivor, but on YouTube, this seems possible, as you can see on this slide. It shows that users see the survivors as a wholesome person and think they know enough of them or know them well enough for a strong judgment. This is a very typical example for communicating positive emotions. Thank you, Paula, for sharing your thoughts and experiences of the Holocaust. I'm impressed by your kind and gentle nature. I'm so sorry that you were robbed of the joys of youth because of a madman and his followers. To sum up this analysis, the virtual in-between of memory is a matrix based on space, time, and agents. Therefore, it can be understood as a chronospatial framework where culture and memory are permanently negotiated. Or to put it into Baba's words, it is the inter that carries the burden of meaning of culture. History and memory of the Shoah have since liberation been part of the process of negotiation. YouTube is a space of its own within the virtual in-between of memory. It shapes the space due to its own framings, algorithms, discourse, and content. Time and space follow their own rule on YouTube. YouTube is a cultural as well as a commercial space. It follows the logics of late capitalism, as I've already mentioned. But what I find most important here, it is a space where history and memory are negotiated. In concluding this case study, I have 6 results that I would like to share with you. The first one is crossings of time and space. Users communicate with each other, with the survivors, and partly with the USC Shoah Foundation over the borders of time and space. Dialogues or communications in the comments are taking place over months, with some users regularly returning to certain commentaries, and thereby they constitute a space of negotiations. Second, subjectivity of users and survivors. The survivors are seen as real people, with all the good and bad consequences that this may have. Their facial expressions, gestures, their way of talking, and also their history are understood as being something very individual. Especially the direct messages towards the survivors that addressed them in person and often with first names show a perception in a virtual encounter, as Assmann and Brauer termed it. The thank you messages and those comments that mark the testimonies as important parts of a global remembrance culture are linking between an online and an offline memory and hint at the virtual sphere partially adding to the analog sphere. However, the mere speech act online is working differently from offline. The very intimate messages of survivors seem to create a kind of environment in which users wish to leave very private messages and reflections themselves. 3. Perception of the interviewer. The interviewers are criticized regularly and often even insulted. These negative reactions towards the interviewers hint at a very intense perception. The interviewers, whom you can't see during the interview, are not seen as individuals themselves, but as stand-ins for the users, and a stand-in easily makes mistakes. There's a communicative conflict between the users, the interviewers, and the survivors. Different to the users, the interviewers had a direct physical contact with the survivors. They could interact with them directly. Users wish for a more intense interaction and are frustrated by the limits of time and space and project this frustration onto the interviewers. So the criticism of the interviewers is a very good indication for us because it shows the intense perception of a testimony. The medial setting, as already discussed, facilitates immersion. The comments on YouTube can therefore be seen as a kind of interaction between users and survivors within the limits of time and space. Concerning the intense perception, the bonding and the wish for direct interaction, it is necessary to reflect critically about one's own immersion, and highly difficult, if I may add. So Christopher Browning has given us a link here that we need to follow up and to think about our own involvement with the testimonies as researchers. 4. Offline and online. The borders between the analog sphere and the virtual remembrance culture become more and more fluid. The virtual in-between reaches a condition which Zygmunt Bauman has called liquid modernity, being constantly in flux. In 2010 and 11, it was commonplace for users to note that they had met the survivors offline, at a school or any other kind of meeting, which is no longer relevant. Online and offline spheres are blending in here. 5. Different common cultures. My analysis has shown that the culture of discourse and communication is different beneath each testimony, especially in regard to the subjectivity of the survivors as well as the users. And 6. The challenges of anti-Semitism and Shoah denial. I've shown you 2 examples of anti-Semitism and Shoah denial earlier in my presentation. You could observe that deniers are watching the testimonies thoroughly and react partly to the individual narration of the survivors. They try to blame the survivors as liars. Most of the time, other users react and try to discuss or block this kind of hate speech. Still, one needs to consider if anti-Semitic or denying comments should be allowed or to be placed beneath survivors' testimonies. With this, I come to my conclusions. I've offered you an epistemological approach and an explanation on why users of the VHA often report to have the feeling like they have really encountered the survivors. The digital has changed our understanding of the chronospatial framework, allowing for communication across the borders of time and space, especially with those being absent. Further on, we changed our understanding of the Speech Act and shifted to a paradoxical space, the virtual in-between of memory. It is here, in this neither the one nor the other, that a new kind of production of meaning takes place. And the web of relations, history and memory are negotiated. The virtual in-between of memory is shaped by the characteristics of the digital. Immersion, interactivity, and instancy. Due to these characteristics, users are drawn into the digital testimonies in the virtual sphere and wish to interact or even intervene. Assmann and Brouwer's virtual encounter is such due to the virtual to the medium. In my PhD study, there are 2 main conclusions that I want to share with you. The first one is the necessity to develop a new digital Quellenkritik, source criticism, for which I offer a model. The second one is the necessity of a discussion of new ethics. I would like to show this in relation to the case study I presented today. Most of the testimonies available on YouTube have only been watched by a very small number of people, 100 to 300 users. Those testimonies that are ranking high in clicks and are often watched because of the logics of the YouTube algorithm, placing them next to another testimony or ranking the testimonies along the numbers of views, counted for them. If I may borrow Todd Presner's term here, this urges us to think about the ethics of an algorithm as researchers as well as educators. To sum up my presentation, professionally we have to conclude that our relation to history but also towards our sources is changing. The virtual in-between of memory is one approach in tackling the fundamental questions that arise from the digital turn. And with this I conclude. Thank you for your attention and I'm looking forward to comments and questions.
things I'm most fascinated about is because digital archiving is so new, this is like the first generation. I'm just would love your point of view of what you think is gonna happen in the next generation. So this generation, we still have that offline, we can meet a survivor and do the testimonies. But soon, the only access you're gonna have to a survivor is through a taped testimony. How do you think that's gonna change history, or the retelling of history? Because it's never happened before, correct?
Has never happened, and we didn't know about the other factors of influence. People who are now looking the testimonies are not used, or in Germany they are still not used to high definition quality. But I've recently heard that those who are used to high definition television see these testimonies are coming from a very old time, as they are not in such a resolution. So we need to take this into account as well and see if it is taken as a still new digital source or as an old-fashioned digital source. I don't know. But to me, it makes the question what changes and what's happening. And what we can see from educational studies is that students now are immersing into the testimonies. But as a historian, you always want to do any kind of predictions. I think I will stick with this because I have no idea in how to predict when looking back. But what I can say is by now it works. But I'm not sure if it will in the same in 10 years because we have no idea where technology develops to.
I have a question. So just in passing, you mentioned, you made a big claim saying digitization changes how we see the past and how we write the past. I would love to hear a little bit more about this.
Yeah. First of all, it changes our approach because we do it through a new medium. And when we say that the medium we have contact to history shapes our understanding of history, we need to see that this is going to happen for the digital as well. As the as video has changed, or as television has changed, the digital would change as well. But to be more precise on how it is going to change, it changes the way we can narrate history, how we can tell stories, how we can combine materials, but also how we can develop new approaches. And I think one telling example is the Anne Frank Museum in the Netherlands. They've done a complete virtual copy of the museum through which you can go. And what they do is offering you a new space for elaborating a place to which you can't go physically because you're queuing up for too long. So this is a new space, and they have a very spatial approach to it. And what I can describe from my research is that most of the digital narration that we can see are bound to space. And this Anne Frank Museum example is very telling because they double a space into a new space for you to explore it.
But would it be then better to say digitization changes how we see and narrate history rather than write?
How we tell history, but I think it's a kind of writing. If you have an online exhibition, this is the kind of writing of telling a story.
I have a question. Thank you so much for your talk. That was very fascinating. I was particularly struck by when you said in the beginning of your talk about how through the Visual History Archive, memory is turned into language. And then, you know, with Homi Bhabha and Aaron's quotes, which I think are really kind of it gives it a very nuanced theoretical foundation. And I really like your, you know, the idea of Bhabha's theory of enunciation, this ongoing articulation of language, and how it can capture the present as it passes into the future. Those were just stuff that I got from your talk. And then you also, the ongoing articulation of language as it captures the present, as it passes to the future. And then you also mentioned in the beginning how the digital archive is also a medium that is to come. So there's this idea of futurity, right? Like, so I'm interested in wanting to hear more about about that, like the relationship between, you know, the digital archive and how the present and the future is, you know, articulated in that, and also how, you know, the term memory into language is related to that. I don't know if that.
Yes. So to the first question about the view into the future, when we have a look on the temporal modes of the digital, we can see that it is always orientated towards the future, and to have a digital archive about the past in this medium that is oriented towards the future is quite distracting, or is there are contradictions arising from this. So what we can see is that the past is negotiated in this ever coming future, and I think for users it is able, or they are able to connect with this past narration because it was spoken once for a future. These testimonies, and I think that makes them special connecting towards the future listeners, is because they were spoken for the future listeners. They were not spoken only because of given testimony, but with this assumption of telling in a future for a future listener. And I think this links very closely to a medium that is always looking to the future. But what we have as a temporal mode in the digital is acceleration. Acceleration is the main mode of doing things. It's getting faster and faster and faster. And then we have this testimonies of 2, 3, 4 hours that are stubbornly resisting any kind of acceleration. And when we have a look at the digital archive with the kind of indexing and with the hyperlinking into the testimonies offers us a kind of acceleration. But we have to see the narration itself. Is it possible to get into the testimony in an accelerated way or not? So I'm thinking about this issue of acceleration because I think it's a future temporal mode here as well, and one that's already present in the medium. And towards your other question, I understand testimony as a kind of dialogue, but also as a moment in which memories are spoken. So it's always something that survivors tell themselves. That moment they have to tell, all those memories are fixed into a new narration because they have to translate it into a communicable way. And this is something I just wanted to point out in my understanding of testimony.
I think one of the takeaways that I have is that people really connect with testimony, maybe in a way they don't with a textbook. But I wanted to ask, what do you think the implications are? What will this mean, 20, 30, 50 years down the road? Will it mean people will be less likely to, sort of let this fade into the past? Or what are the implications, I guess?
Difficult question. I just said I'm not going to make predictions.
Oh yeah.
But let me try. I think what we can see now can make us a bit hopeful, as students are able to immerse into the testimonies and to really get into a contact with them, to have a kind of encounter. But from my approach, I can describe this out of postmodern theory. If you have a look on educational theory or on neurolinguistics, they will have another explanation on why this is happening. And I can't say from my reading of their ideas if they won't predict that something is changing so radically that there is a kind of forgetting. But I mean, forgetting is always part of the archive as well. So the moment it's in the archive doesn't mean it's secure for the future. The archive is just giving us materials for future education. So in the end, I'm not sure if it indicates in any way to what the future might bring, but should be more discussed in educational practice, I think.
You mentioned that one of the outcomes of your dissertation is a new source critique. So why do you think there is a need for a new source critique, and what kind of source critique are you envisioning there?
This is a very German approach, I think, on the kind of Quellenkritik or source critique. It's always this question in how we understand the source from which we are trying to write history. And what I say in this is that we need to take the media into account for the source criticism and to see how the digital is changing. And there was one moment in my talk when I said that we need to be aware of our own immersion and our own interaction with the testimonies. And to me, one part of this source criticism that I think is necessary is understanding how the digital media is changing the way we perceive the testimonies, and according to that, finding a way in describing our own relation towards the testimony and making obvious how we relate to it. This is not answering your question fully.
No, I'm thinking, aren't we supposed to do this with any kind of source we use? What does make the difference?
The difference is taken in the digital and taken in what the digital means, and it's not a whole new source criticism approach here, but it's given in some ideas on how to approach the digital testimonies. So what I'm looking for is a source criticism on the digital testimonies, and this includes how the media itself is working in the testimonies or is shaping the testimonies. And this is, for example, something when you see your research and when you see someone like Mary Fulbrook writing about Benjin, and she's describing pre-war life, Jewish life there. And she derives this notions of pre-war life from 36 VHA testimonies. What she does not show to us is how did she find these interviews? Why did she take this 36, and which parts of the testimonies did she take? So I think we need to reflect on how we decide for certain segments of testimonies, how we find them, and we have to make that obvious to our readers on how we had a look on this digital material.
Do you not agree, Wolf? I'm seeing you thinking.
Yeah, because we don't do this for other sources. So we don't explain why I'm selecting certain files in the archive. So, I mean, I would still challenge you and say, why would this be necessary for digital sources, and I don't do this for kind of paper or analog sources?
But you should. No, I mean, what we are doing is we are describing a story, and before we are describing the top story or telling the story, we are saying in our methodologic announcements on how we've done it.
Okay, yeah.
And to me, reflecting the research in the digital archive is part of saying how we've done it.
Oh, okay. So
And that's,
yeah.
I think really
I would agree with
important.
that, yeah. Any more questions? Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
and thank you, Alina.
Thank you.
That was great.